They say the measure of a man is how he treats people who can't do a single thing for him. I've believed that my whole life, and I've watched it prove itself true more times than I can count. The folks who look at a quiet old man in a feed store cap and a faded jacket and decide right then that he's nobody worth their time, they show you everything about themselves in about 4 seconds. They just don't know they're doing it. And the ones who mistake my silence for slowness, my patience for ignorance, well, those are always the ones I end up remembering. My name is Earl Dawson. I'm 67 years old, and I drive a 1999 Ford F-150 the color of a dust storm with a tailgate that you have to lift just so or it won't latch. My daughter has been after me for years to put it out to pasture. I keep telling her it runs fine, which is mostly true, and that I'm fond of it, which is entirely true. I live on Sycamore Street in a town outside Cincinnati, where the houses were built when men still came home for lunch, and I've lived in the same one for 34 years. My neighbor Hank, a retired shop teacher who grows the worst tomatoes I have ever seen a grown man be proud of, leaned over our shared fence one Saturday last spring and told me I was the cheapest man he'd ever met, who somehow always picked up the check. I told him I just had a good memory for who'd paid last. He laughed. I let him. Here is what Hank doesn't know. What the boys at the diner where I take my coffee at 6:15 every morning don't know. What the young fella at the Ford dealership didn't know when he tried to walk me toward a new King Ranch, and I smiled and said the old one. And I weren't done with each other yet. I own Granite Ridge Holdings, building materials distribution, freight and logistics, a stake in 2 regional media outfits, commercial real estate scattered across 6 states, and a couple of holdings down in Texas I half forget I have. I built it the slow way, starting with 1 lumber yard and a line of credit I had to beg for, working it up over 40 years of waking before the sun and going to bed long after Ruth, my late wife, had given up waiting for me. My name doesn't sit on the door of any of it. There's no profile of me anywhere, no photograph at a ribbon cutting, no plaque on a hospital wing. The whole thing is layered through holding companies and trusts, so that you'd have to want it badly and dig for a year to find me at the bottom. Granite Ridge is worth a hair over $2.4 billion on a slow year. And I did all that hiding on purpose, and I want to tell you why before anybody decides I'm some kind of strange old recluse playing games. My older brother Dale came into a little money once. Not much by my standards now, a settlement after a plant injury, maybe $400,000. And I watched what that money did. I watched cousins we hadn't heard from in 15 years find their way back. I watched his own kids start measuring each other. By the time Dale passed, that family was strangers wearing the same last name, every one of them poisoned by a number. I was 30 years old when I sat at his funeral, and I made myself a promise. Whatever I built, my family would never be turned into vultures by knowing the size of it. They'd love each other for who they were, or they wouldn't, but money would never get a vote. So let me tell you about my daughter, because she's the whole reason any of this matters. Caroline is 36. She is, and I say this as plainly as I know how, the best thing I ever made, and I made some things. She's got her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that starts quiet in the back of a room, and then somehow ends up running the place. When she was 8, she talked me out of a punishment using an argument so well constructed, I had to leave the kitchen so she wouldn't see me grinning. Ruth and I raised her in that house on Sycamore on what looked, from the outside, like a comfortable middle-class life, because that's what I wanted her to have. A regular childhood, public school, a summer job scooping ice cream. She has never once, to this day, fully understood what her father is worth, and that was the point. What I did not see coming was the man she'd marry. 3 years ago, Caroline brought home Brett Mercer. Now I want to be fair to Brett. I really do. I've hired and let go of enough men in my life to know a first impression isn't a verdict. So let me put it as kindly as I can manage. Brett Mercer is the kind of man who shakes your hand for about 2 seconds too long while looking over your shoulder to see if anyone more important has walked in. He's 39, fit in the way of a man with a personal trainer and a calendar reminder. And he has a Wharton MBA that you will learn about, I promise you, inside the first 10 minutes of meeting him. Within that first conversation at my kitchen table, he found a way to mention the MBA, a ski trip to Aspen, and a watch I was apparently supposed to recognize. I nodded. I told him that all sounded real nice, son. And it did. There's nothing wrong with any of it. It was the hunger underneath it I clocked, the way some men can't sit in a room without first establishing the pecking order. Here is where it gets interesting, and I need you to stay with me. 6 months after he met my daughter, Brett Mercer was named CEO of Keystone Logistics. 380 employees, freight contracts up and down the Ohio Valley, a solid little company with good bones. And Keystone Logistics is a wholly owned subsidiary of Granite Ridge Holdings, which is to say, it is mine. Brett got that job through what looked, from every angle, like a clean and competitive process. An executive search firm, 3 rounds of interviews, reference checks, a board vote, spotless. What nobody knew, what Brett does not know to this hour, is that I controlled every inch of it from a quiet office he's never seen. I read his interviews transcripts. I called 2 of his references myself, just to listen to how they hedged. I approved his package. And then I drove home, changed into my work pants, and spent the evening putting in tomato cages along the back fence. He texted me that night. "Big day, Earl. Just got named CEO, Caroline's thrilled." I wrote back, "Hard work pays off, proud of you, son." Then I went and watched the news. I meant it too. That's the part people don't believe. I genuinely hoped he'd grow into the chair. I'd seen men do it, get a little real responsibility and find out they were better than they'd been pretending to be. I gave Brett every tool a man could want, and I waited to be surprised. He didn't surprise me. He just kept showing me, a little at a time, exactly who he was. It started small. At a Keystone holiday party, his company, he believed, he introduced me to a younger VP who asked what I did for a living. Before I could open my mouth, Brett jumped in. "Oh, this is Caroline's dad. Retired." And then, with a hand on my shoulder steering me gently toward the punch bowl, "Get yourself something to eat, Earl." And just like that, I'd been escorted to the edge of the room like an uncle who'd had one too many. I got myself a deviled egg. I filed it away. The moment that actually decided things came on a Tuesday in March. I'd stopped by Keystone's offices to handle something through one of my holding reps, boring stuff, lease paperwork, and I was just an old man in a windbreaker that nobody glanced at twice, which is exactly how I like to move through a building. I was passing the hallway near the executive floor when I heard Brett's voice around the corner, talking to another fella, easy and loose, the way you talk when you're sure nobody who matters is listening. "Caroline's dad? He's harmless," Brett was saying, and I could hear the smile riding on top of it. "Sweet guy. Peaked a long time ago, you can tell. Drives this truck that's older than my assistant. Caroline feels like she's got to look after him. It's a lot, honestly, but what are you going to do? Family's family." A little laugh. "He'll potter around that garden of his till he keels over." I straightened my jacket, and I walked back the way I'd come. "Peaked a long time ago. He'll potter around that garden till he keels over." I let those words sit with me for 4 months. My father, who came up hard and quiet, used to tell me the river doesn't argue with the rock. It just keeps coming, and one day the rock isn't there anymore. I've been a river my whole life. I can wait. And before I tell you about the dinner, because there was a dinner, and it changed everything, do me a small favor if you've gotten this far. Tap that subscribe button. It doesn't cost you a thing, and it means the world to an old man telling his story. All right, where was I? The invitation came in May. Caroline called me, bubbling over the way she does. Brett's parents, Lawrence and Diane Mercer, were hosting a family dinner at their place out in Indian Hill. And if you don't know Cincinnati, Indian Hill is where the money goes to be quiet about itself. Big lots behind long driveways, horse fences, the whole thing. Lawrence was a retired private equity man. Diane was the sort of woman whose entire sense of self is built on the square footage behind her. "Dad, you'll love them," Caroline told me. "They're really warm." I told her I was sure they were. I already knew a few things about the Mercers' finances that would have made that a hard sentence for her to finish, but I kept those to myself. I'd met them once, briefly, at the wedding 3 years back. A small ceremony, Caroline's choice, more pie than champagne, but I'd never been to their home. This was to be the first real sit-down. One big happy family. Then Brett called me himself, which was unusual enough to be worth noticing. He was friendly in that particular way. People get friendly right before they say something they know is a little ugly. "Hey, so heads up for Saturday," he said. "Mom and Dad are kind of old school, you know? Formal. So it might be good to, I don't know, dress up a little, nothing fancy. Just maybe a notch sharper than the usual." There was a pause on the line waiting for me to feel small. "I'll find something, son," I said. And I did mean to. I want to be honest with you about that Saturday, because it sat at the center of everything. And there's a part of it I'm not proud of, and a part of it I'd do again. I put on clean khakis, and a pressed flannel shirt and an old canvas jacket that had belonged to me longer than Brett had been alive. I did not put on a suit. I have a closet of them, charcoal and navy, tailored years ago by a man in Cincinnati who's since retired, and I left every one of them on the rod. I told myself I was being practical, that I'd be comfortable. That was a lie, and I knew it even then. The truth is, I wanted to walk into that house as exactly the man they'd already decided I was. I wanted to give them every chance to show me the whole of themselves. A man learns more in a room where he's underestimated than in any room where he's feared. I drove the F-150 out to Indian Hill with the windows down, because the AC does what it pleases. The driveway alone was longer than my street. There was a young man in a vest parked out front to take cars, and the look he gave my truck was its own little essay. I handed him the keys and tipped him $40 up front, and I watched his whole face rearrange itself. Diane Mercer met me in a foyer with a chandelier the size of my kitchen. She took both my hands in both of hers, the way people do when they want the gesture to stand in for the feeling. "Earl," she said, warm as a heat lamp, "we have heard so much about you. You are just the sweetest thing." Sweet, first word out, not glad to meet you, not welcome. Sweet, the word you use for a dog or a great aunt who's lost the thread of the conversation. "Thank you, Diane," I said. "Beautiful home." She glowed. People who've poured their whole soul into a house never get tired of hearing about the house. Caroline came across the room and folded into me the way she has since she was a little girl, and I held that hug a half-second past comfortable, just for me. "You came," she whispered. "Course I did, sweetheart," I said. Brett appeared behind her, and his eyes went to my flannel, and there was that flicker. Half a second, then gone, swallowed by the recovery smile. I caught it. I always catch it. "Earl, glad you made it," he said, clapping my shoulder for the benefit of the room. "Dad's got something special opened up." Something special. That turned out to be the theme of the whole night. The wine was something special. The view was something special. The house, the family, the catering, everything was special, except for me, and I was the one thing in that house that actually was. We sat down to a table set the way people set a table when the point isn't dinner but distance. The heavy silver, the crystal candles that had clearly never been lit and never would be again. I unfolded my napkin and I made myself invisible. Not because anyone could have forced that on me. Because I chose it. The most dangerous thing a man can do in a room full of people who underestimate him is correct them too early. So I asked polite questions. I complimented a wine I hadn't tasted, and I watched. Lawrence ran the table the way men like Lawrence always do, from the front loud, with the bottomless confidence of a man who has never once been told he talks too much. He held forth on the markets, on a trip to Scotland, on Brett's extraordinary instincts at Keystone. "The board adores him," Lawrence said, swirling his glass. "Leadership's a bloodline thing, I've always said." He glanced at me when he said it, just for a beat, the way you do when you want to draw a line between two men without having to say a word out loud. I nodded along. "You must be proud," I said. Then Diane turned to my daughter with a smile that had a very particular shape to it. "And Caroline, sweetheart, you must feel so taken care of, having a husband who provides like Brett does. Not every girl's so fortunate." The table went quiet for a fraction of a second. Caroline smiled, gracious as ever, but I saw her eyes. I picked up my water and took a slow sip and said not one word. Because the envelope hadn't come out yet, and I knew, the way you know a storm by the smell of the air, that when it did, everything at that table was going to turn over. I just had to be patient a little longer. It came with dessert. I'd been at that table close to 2 hours. 2 hours of nodding, of asking after things I already understood, of laughing at Lawrence's stories which were not as funny as Lawrence believed. I'd worn the part like an old coat. The sweet retired dad, the fellow with the funny truck who'd peaked early and pottered in his garden. And then Lawrence reached down beside his chair, and I felt that old familiar shift in my chest, the one that tells me we've gone from talk to business. He laid a leather folder on the table, smoothed it once with the flat of his hand, and slid it across to me. "Earl," he said, and his voice dropped into the rehearsed register of a man who'd practiced this in the mirror. "There's something we'd love to discuss, as a family." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. Diane had folded her hands. Brett had gone very still in the way a man goes still when he's working hard to look relaxed. Caroline glanced at me, quick and uncertain, and then back at her father-in-law. "Brett has a vision," Lawrence said, "a real one. His own venture, built from the ground up, the kind of opportunity that comes along once. We believe in him completely. What he needs is startup capital." He tapped the folder. "And what we're proposing is straightforward. Caroline's inheritance, pledged as collateral to secure the initial funding. All legal, properly drawn, above board. We just need your blessing, Earl, as her father. Now, I want to tell you what that inheritance actually was because it matters. When Ruth passed, she'd left a modest trust for Caroline, the paid-off house we never sold, a life insurance payout, a college fund that had grown somewhere around $700,000, real money to most folks, a visible, ordinary, explainable amount, and the only money tied to Caroline's name that anyone outside my lawyers had ever heard of. Caroline knew about it. She'd mentioned it to the Mercers at some point, the innocent way a person does. And the Mercers had filed it away and decided it was a door they could walk through. They weren't reaching for billions they didn't know existed. They were reaching for a widow's trust set up for a daughter, and asking that daughter's father to hand it over so their son could play businessman. I looked at Lawrence, then at Diane, whose smile had the fixed quality of something applied with a brush, then at Brett, calm, certain, already spending money in his head that he'd decided was his, and I thought, you have no earthly idea who you just slid that folder to. I opened it. I read every page, slow, every clause, every figure, while the clock on the wall counted off the seconds and nobody at that table dared breathe. Then I closed it, set it gently down, picked up my water, took an unhurried sip, and gave Lawrence Mercer the warmest smile I own. I appreciate all the thought that went into this, I said pleasantly. I'll look it over carefully. Lawrence let out a breath he'd been holding for an hour. Brett's shoulders came down half an inch. Diane reached for her wine like a woman who believes the hard part is behind her. They thought they'd won. I made small talk for another 20 minutes, thanked Diane for a lovely evening, shook Lawrence's hand. A full one this time, firm, my eyes on his a second longer than they needed to be. He had no idea what that second meant. The valet brought my truck around. The engine cleared its throat. I pulled down that long driveway and out onto the road, and I was calmer than I'd been all week. Calm in a way that would have scared anybody who knew what I was about to do. I said nothing for 2 weeks, not a word, not a ripple. I worked my garden Sunday morning and had coffee with Hank on Wednesday and went to the 8 o'clock service and drove the truck to the Kroger and back. On the 4th day, Brett texted me, "Hey Earl, just checking in. Did you get a chance to look over the proposal? Exciting stuff, right?" I waited 3 hours. Then I wrote, "Still reviewing, son. These things take time." He sent a thumbs up. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and made a call. Not to Brett. Not to Lawrence. To 3 men on the Keystone board, men who'd known me a long while, men who understood that when I called direct, it isn't a social visit. Run the audit, I said. Full scope. Start tomorrow. Then I went back outside to my tomatoes, because here's what I knew that Brett Mercer didn't. I'd written his employment contract myself, every line of it. And buried in the middle was a non-compete and fiduciary duty clause I'd drafted years before Brett ever walked into my daughter's life. The kind of clause I put in for exactly one type of man. The type who's certain he's the smartest person in any room he stands in. Brett had signed it 3 years ago, without reading it carefully enough. They never read it carefully enough. The audit took 11 days. When the report finally landed on my desk, I sat with it a long while, not because it surprised me. It didn't. But because I wanted to be sure, all the way sure, before I did what came next. Brett had been building his own company for the better part of 8 months. On Keystone time, on Keystone laptops, using Keystone's client list and Keystone's vendor relationships to stand up an outfit that would compete directly with Granite Ridge's own logistics arms. Quietly, carefully, dead certain that nobody above him was paying attention. He'd forgotten the one thing that should never be forgotten. You cannot build something in secret inside a house that belongs to the man you're hiding it from. Every meeting, every file, every contact made on the company's dime. Every bit of it a clean violation of the clause he'd signed. Every bit of it documented. Every bit of it sitting in a folder on my desk on a Thursday morning when I took the charcoal suit out of the back of my closet, the one pressed the night before, and drove the F-150 to Keystone Logistics. I parked in the reserved space out front. The one with the little brass placard that reads Granite Ridge Holdings, resorted. The one Brett Mercer had walked past 3 days a week for 3 years and never once wondered about. I walked into the executive conference room and sat down at the head of the table. Board members to my left, 2 attorneys to my right, the audit findings in front of me. And in about 4 minutes, my son-in-law was going to come through that door, believing he was there for a routine check-in. I squared the folder in front of me. I waited. The door opened. He came in carrying his confidence like a tailored coat, easy, natural. He took in the board, the lawyers, the documents, and then his eyes found me, at the head of his table, in his conference room, in a suit he'd never once seen me wear. I watched it move across his face in real time, floor by floor, like a man riding an elevator down through everything he thought he understood. The search firm, the contract, the reserved space out front, the proud smile on his father's face, the folder sliding across the dinner table. 3 years arriving all at once on a Thursday morning. The silence held for a good 10 seconds. I let every one of them land. "Sit down, Brett," I said. He sat. "I'm going to say this once," I told him, "and I want you to hear me. I'm not angry. Anger is for men who got blindsided. I saw this coming the day you slid a printout of a watch across my kitchen counter and told me what it cost." I opened the folder. Keystone Logistics is owned by Granite Ridge Holdings. Granite Ridge Holdings is owned by me and has been since before you finished your first degree. The chair you sit in, the salary you draw, the whole reputation you've built your identity around. It exists because I built the thing it's standing on. I put you in that chair because I wanted to believe in what I saw. I gave you every resource a man could ask for. And for 8 months you used those resources to build something designed to cut the legs out from under the very company that made you. I closed the folder. The clause in your contract covers every single thing this audit turned up. Our attorneys are prepared to take it all the way if I tell them to. Every ounce of the confidence he'd carried in was gone. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, very young and very small, and a long way from Aspen. "But I'm not interested in burying you," I said. "I'm interested in clarity. So here's how it goes. You resign today. Quietly, professionally. Your name stays clean, and this stays inside these walls. Or we go the legal route, and everything in this folder becomes a matter of public record." He looked at the board members. Neutral. At the lawyers. Back at me. And I'll be honest with you, what I saw in his eyes wasn't what I'd braced for. Not defiance, not the scramble of a man working an angle. It was shame. The real kind. The deep, quiet kind that only shows up when a man finally sees himself clearly and can't stand what's looking back. "I'll resign," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "Good," I said. I stood up, buttoned the jacket, picked up the folder. At the door, I turned back. "One more thing. That proposal your father put on the table. Caroline's inheritance as collateral. I let that sit for about 1 second. My attorneys moved her trust this morning into an account in her name alone, irrevocable, requiring her signature and nobody else's. So your father's proposal is now a very official document about money that no longer lives where he thinks it does. Tell your folks I said thank you for dinner. The lamb was excellent." I drove home in the truck. The engine cleared its throat at the first turn of the key. The AC came on for a block and then thought better of it. The cracked side mirror caught the last of the afternoon sun as I turned onto Sycamore and pulled into my own driveway, and I sat there a minute. Just sat. 34 years of being the man nobody looked at twice, and knowing the whole time exactly who I was. I patted the dash once, the way you'd pat an old dog. Good girl. Then I went inside and called my daughter. She came 20 minutes later and found me at the kitchen table, where she'd done her homework as a kid, 2 cups of tea already poured because I'd never learned to wait for company to start the kettle. She sat down across from me and studied my face a long moment, the way she's read my face since she was small, like a map she's known her whole life. I told her all of it. The company, the structure, how the CEO search had really gone, the clause I'd written years before Brett existed, the audit, the conference room, the trust I'd moved into her name. I laid it all out, quiet, while the tea went cold between us. When I finished, she didn't speak for a long time. And then she looked up at me and asked the one question I'd been carrying the answer to for the better part of 30 years. "Dad," she said, her voice small, "why didn't you ever tell me any of it?" I looked down at my cup. I looked out the window at the dark shape of the garden. I looked back at my girl, at her mother's eyes set in her face, at the laugh I knew was hiding somewhere underneath all that hurt, at the 8-year-old who'd once argued me right out of the room. "Because I wanted you to choose your own life," I told her. "Not have it chosen for you by what I owned. I never wanted you to look across a table at me and see a company. I wanted you to see your father. That's all I ever wanted you to see," she cried then. I reached across and held her hand, and I let her. And somewhere out in Indian Hill, I knew, Lawrence Mercer was sitting very still, and Diane was setting down her wine, and Brett was somewhere trying to find the words to explain to his parents how the quiet old man in the flannel shirt, the one with the funny truck, had turned out to be the last person on God's earth they should have ever even for 1 second mistaken for harmless. I thought about all of that, and then I let it go, because the only thing in the world that mattered to me was sitting right across that table, both hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, eyes red, smiling at me through every bit of it. My daughter, the best thing I ever built.